South Africa's ruling African National Congress has said it wants to form a national unity government with major opposition parties after it lost its majority in general elections last week for the first time since the country's first post-apartheid elections 30 years ago. Now, the plan was announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa on Thursday after days of negotiation within the ANC and other major parties. It comes after speculation over whether the ANC might try to form a grand coalition government with its nearest political rival, the DA, talking about the Democratic Alliance, to control parliament, or whether it will try to work with the MK party of the former President Jacob Zuma, who gains in the election came at the direct cost of the ANC. Now joining me on the program is Ivor, Chipkin, co-founder and director at New South Institute. Thank you for your time, Ivor.
Ivor, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great friend of Nigeria and Nigerians.
Thank you also for making our time to be on the conversation. Let me start off with this straight question. What do you make of last week's election?
So the first thing to note, and I think this is a great tribute to South Africa and a great tribute to South Africans, is that the ANC lost its majority, substantially lost its majority. It's a 30% decline from the 2019 election, where it had 57% and has dropped to 40%, barely 40%, which is a 30% decline. And yet, on hearing the news, Ramaphosa made a very gracious statement of absolutely accepting the results. So there was no contestation of the legitimacy of the election, accepting that it was free and fair. And I think this is a very extraordinary and a very important gesture of acknowledging, recognizing the fundamental character of South Africa's democracy and of the constitutional principles which underpin it. So I think that is the first takeaway from South Africa's election. The ANC has dropped dramatically. It's fallen below 50%. It can't form a government on its own, and yet it has accepted the results with graciously.
This is the first in 30 years of the control of the ANC. In the country now. This also is a new political phase for South Africa. How much of an impact do you think this will have on the political structure of the country?
Oh, I think we're in unprecedented territory. We've never been in any situation like this before, even including from the apartheid period. The apartheid period, you'll recall, was dominated overwhelmingly by the Nationalist Party. It never lost an election. The ANC has been in power, has been a dominant political party since 1994. We're now in historically unprecedented territory where no political party can form a government. And we're in the space of coalition. So this is where we are now. I think there's great anxiety about the current situation, especially around the constellation of forces that come together and forming a government. And even if we manage to form a government, I think there's great concern around who the parties are to the new government, but also around the long-term stability of these governments. I think nobody in South Africa wants a situation of ongoing instability. We've had a window into the situation from the previous election, especially at local government level, where especially at the city urban areas, we've had unstable coalitions now for at least 5 years, and it hasn't been pretty. So I think there's a great worry around what the constellation of parties coming to form a government, and B, how stable those alliances are going to be.
Now, you talked about South Africa entering a phase of uncharted territory politically. Now, we have a situation where the top parties are looking to form some sort of coalition. We're talking about parties like the ANC, the MK party, the DA, the EFF, and all of these parties have different political ideology. How do you think a possible coalition can work?
So, I like your question very much. And I think if one thinks around the constellation of parties, not just in terms of their own interests, but in terms of what they represent, what their politics are, what their ideologies are, I think you can start to see a broad polarization of South African politics, or rather an elaboration of politics. You have, on the one hand, represented by the Democratic Alliance, for example, which did fairly well, stable. It even grew slightly, grew into areas of historically of Black African areas in Cape Town and even in Soweto, which was the large former African township of during the apartheid period. It grew in those areas modestly. But what you have there is a substantial poll in South Africa of kind of, if you want, liberal democratic politics, believes in the constitutional framework, believes in human rights, liberal values, and it believes in a market economy. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as you mentioned, the growth of parties like the MK Party, formed by former President Jacob Zuma, a party which one could argue, I think, in a compelling way, a party grounded in ethnicity, a strong Zulu base in KwaZulu-Natal, where it completely decimated with the African National Congress. Quite extraordinary growth of the party, both in the province, but also nationally. Coming to power, coming to a position of authority on the basis of a rejection of South Africa's constitutional framework. So this is a party which unambiguously is opposed to the Constitution. It would do away with the Constitution. It claims to support something which it calls parliamentary sovereignty, by which it means strong majority rule through a parliament, a bit like the British system of the dominance of the elected government of the day. Whether that mutates into more authoritarian ideas of politics is an open question. So you have that on the one hand. You also have, which didn't do particularly well, stable, declined slightly, was the Economic Freedom Fighters, which I think for them was a great disappointment, because they think of themselves as a revolutionary movement, a wave moving more and more towards the levers of power. And I think what this represents, I think in my mind at least, is the stalling of that process. But the EFF, again, is a party deeply critical of the constitutional framework, and also critical of market economies, open in favor of the nationalization of the large portion of the economy. So if you like, you have on the one hand a kind of liberal democratic bloc, and you have on the other hand a large populist nationalist bloc. Where is the ANC in the middle of this? And so ANC is the decisive kingmaker in terms of this. And there it's a little bit more difficult to get a sense of. So I've recently argued, if you look at the politics of Cyril Ramaphosa, I've argued that he represents a kind of illiberalism. In other words, he's been content to accommodate within his cabinet people that are ambivalent, let us say, around the constitutional framework, people implicated in corruption, people who have not performed in their portfolios. He's been quite at ease tolerating them within the cabinet. But he's also tried successfully, some argue, less successfully, others argue, to push through some fundamental reforms in favor of a market economy. So this is why I call him an illiberal liberal, favoring kind of a market economy on the one hand, and yet tolerant of people that are more critical of the constitutional framework. So the question going forward is, which way will the ANC fall? Will it fall on the side of liberal democracy and ally with the Democratic Alliance, or will it fall on the side of populist nationalism and end up allying in some kind of constellation with either the MK Party? I think is unlikely. More likely, perhaps, is some sort of coalition with the Economic Freedom Fighters. But that very much is where South African politics is, in my mind at least.
But if you had the opportunity to sort of give some sort of advice to the president, which of the parties would you suggest?
Well, I think South Africa's constitution is something deeply worthwhile and deeply worth protecting. So I would certainly not be in favor of what I've called the populist nationalist bloc. I think South Africa would do great, would benefit enormously by protecting and deepening the gains of South Africa's democratic constitution. In work that I've done previously, in which I think your channel has covered, we've discussed the period of state capture, which was really an assault on the constitutional framework of South Africa. So I'm a deep and fundamental believer in South Africa's constitution. So I would err in favor of those parties that want to defend and protect South Africa's constitution. I'm also open-minded around a market economy. So I think that in the current situation, I think an alliance or a link-up between between the ANC and the DA and other parties which share similar sorts of politics would be the most in the current situation would probably be the most opportune alliance. But going forward, I look forward to the idea when once again there is a kind of a left Labour Party in South Africa which believes in the constitution, supports market economics, but is also deeply concerned with the questions of inequality. So those sorts of that question I think is not on the agenda currently, which is rather sad.
All right, let's talk about the South African people. We know that currently some of the burning issues in the country includes unemployment, poverty, insecurity. There's also the health crisis there, and power. I mean, looking at all of these fundamentals when it comes to problems, what do you see happening in terms of a solution forward for the people of South Africa should a coalition eventually happen?
So I think what has been at the top of the agenda, or if not at the top, high on the current agenda, is dealing with questions of power. As you mentioned, South Africa suffers from a huge crisis of power now for over a decade, a situation which has gotten worse since around 2015, 2016, where the state power company underwent what we call the period of state capture, fundamental weakening of the institution, hobbling of its technical capacity, and followed by tremendous blackouts, what we call load shedding, throughout the country, with huge consequences both in households, but also and especially for the economy. So that issue has been high on the agenda. All political parties claim that this is of a priority for them, and all seek to address it. They all have different priorities around how to address it. I think one of the key issues around is the relationship between the current state power company, Eskom it's called, and renewable energies, the relationship of the mix of the energy mix. And I think this is where you see that question of how that should be resolved. There's a strong disagreement between the political parties. So I think this question of power and how it's resolved is the key one. Related to that is the question of water. The large urban areas, for example, related to the crisis of electricity, often without water for extensive periods of time. As you might know, South Africa is a country in a dry climate with substantial water shortages. So the management of water is a key area, and I think in many areas there are huge problems around that. Of course, the unemployment is very, very severe. And I think there again, the question is around the relationship between economic growth, the kinds of policies that will achieve economic growth, but at the same time, preserve the gains which have been achieved around Black economic empowerment and the transformation of South Africa's economy. And these are really the fundamental questions which animate political debate in South Africa.
Now, for the ANC, there was, of course, quite a number of corruption scandal, that engulfed the party during, of course, its previous administration, where even the president, was caught up in the Falafala scandal, and then some other key officers within the ANC, wrapped around corruption cases, and now we are looking at a situation whereby the same ANC might get into a coalition with one of the opposition parties that have been very vocal on this issue of corruption. Yeah. How do you see a situation of accountability in any way coming to bear here?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. I mean, in a very quick and short answer to your question, I think that in the current situation, accountability is going to suffer. I think all sorts of political deals are going to be made in the coalition conversations, which will sacrifice accountability, precisely because calling to account various parties raises some very, very difficult questions around the personnel and personalities in key political parties, both within the African National Congress, but also within other parties. So this question of corruption, which South Africa likes to talk endlessly about, I actually think that there is not much appetite in key political parties to fundamentally address it. I was involved in one of the key studies of what was called state capture in South Africa. Several academics and I published a report in 2017 called "The Betrayal of the Promise," which was the first kind of major analysis of state capture in South Africa. And it helped animate, galvanize a large civil society protest movement that which ultimately brought, which gave momentum to the investigation or the inquiry, the judicial inquiry into state capture. An enormous amount of information has surfaced about corruption, around state capture, around the abuse of state offices, around the abuse of state-owned enterprises. A huge amount of information has been placed in the public domain, both by our work, but also by the judicial inquiry into state capture. And yet there's been very little movement on actual prosecutions. My own sense is that there are many in government, in political power, in opposition parties that are quite ready to sacrifice prosecutions against corruption in favor of political stability. So my sense is that that's probably not we're probably not going to make too much progress in the struggle against corruption. Those remarks might be unpopular or controversial, but that's certainly my sense at the moment.
All right, Ivor, just before I let you go, what do you predict happening in the coming weeks?
Oh, if I was a gambler, I would, strangely enough, I would put my money on a DA-ANC alliance, actually. I suspect that there's enormous pressure on, especially if Cyril Ramaphosa survives in his position, and I think there must be enormous, I think he must be struggling for his life within the ANC. But if he survives, then I think a DA-ANC coalition is the most likely, but framed more broadly in terms of a government of national unity. And I think in the end, a government of national unity will really mean a DA-ANC alliance. So if you like, it's the rhetoric which will allow a DA-ANC alliance. That's certainly my sense of the most likely.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the program. Ivor Chipkin, co-founder and director, New South Institute. Once again, thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.